I'd like to welcome the audience, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Indigenous LGBTQ Two-Spirits at AIDS 2020, our virtual webinar. This is the final webinar in a series of 3 Indigenous workshops to help Indigenous communities prepare for AIDS 2020 virtual, the 23rd International AIDS Conference. This webinar will be recorded and posted online. This webinar is also brought to you by the International Indigenous HIV and AIDS Community and the Interagency Coalition on AIDS and Development. My name is Albert Beck. I'll be the moderator for this session. I've been an AIDS and LGBTQ Two-Spirit activist since 1995. I have been infected and living with HIV since 1992. And I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation, which is located in Western Canada, and we're one of the 3 constitutionally recognized people in Canada. I'm going to boast a little bit about my international work. I'm a 2017 Indigenous Fellow, which is a program that's offered by the UN's Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. And I'm also a member of the Conference Coordinating Committee for this international conference. I currently reside in Ottawa, and I work as a senior policy analyst at the Métis National Council. And my pronouns are he, him, she, and her. I'm really honored to be the moderator for the session. Each presentation will last for about 10 minutes. After all presentations, we will ask a question. We'll have a question and answer period. You're welcome to type questions into the chat box at any time, and questions will be answered after all 4 of the speakers have presented. You can also send questions after all the speakers have presented. So if your questions aren't answered through this session, we will be glad to collect those and respond. I just want to share a little bit with the audience on the history of the Indigenous global response to HIV before we get into our presentations. So for more than 3 decades, the Indigenous peoples around the world have been on a path leading the Indigenous response to HIV. Early collective action began during the International AIDS Conference in Montreal, Canada in 1989. The initial leadership was provided by the National Native American AIDS Prevention Center in the United States and by the Te Rupu Tatoko Trust in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I think I probably made a mess of that and apologize. The first International Indigenous AIDS Conference was also hosted in Auckland in New Zealand in 1991. The following year, an informal ad hoc meeting of international Indigenous peoples met during the 8th International AIDS Conference in Amsterdam, Holland in 1992. In 1993, they met again at the annual International AIDS Conference located in Berlin, Germany. The Indigenous peoples who gathered at the early meetings listed above were considered an ad hoc group, although they were determined to meet every International AIDS Conference. The loose connection of activists began to formalize when in 2005, the International Indigenous Peoples Satellite Planning Committee was formed to plan the next year's Indigenous Satellite Conference. By 2006, the working group called themselves the International Indigenous HIV/AIDS Secretariat and organized their first ever Indigenous pre-conference preceding the International AIDS Conference in Toronto, Canada. The intent of that was that IHAC would continue collective action or recommendations and priorities developed by over 300 participants, most notably the Toronto Charter, which is an Indigenous Peoples Action Plan on HIV and AIDS. In 2008, the group organized the second pre-conference of the Indigenous and Afro-descendant people at the International AIDS Conference in Mexico City, which was particularly relevant for the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. It showed the response by our peoples to HIV and AIDS and the cross-cutting themes of sexuality and human rights. Finally, there was a unification of the agendas of Indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples in the face of racism and all forms of discrimination. After formalizing as the International Indigenous Working Group on HIV and AIDS, IGWA met and conducted strategic planning during the Indigenous Satellite at the Indigenous AIDS Conference in Vienna, Australia in July 2010. After finalizing the International Indigenous Strategic Plan on HIV and AIDS for Indigenous peoples and communities from 2011 to 27, IGWA hosted an Indigenous Peoples Networking Zone in the Global Village of the International AIDS Conference and the International Indigenous Pre-Conference in the United States in 2012, in Australia in 2014, and South Africa in 2016. The International Indigenous HIV/AIDS Community was incorporated in March of 2015. This new organization became a civil society partner with the International AIDS Society for AIDS in 2018 and AIDS 2020. The IGWA and IIHAC engaged in strategic planning in Durban, South Africa, and in Ottawa, Canada, which resulted in the publication of a new international strategic plan for 2018-2024. In 2018, the IGWA and IIHAC have a strong presence at the 22nd International AIDS Conference in Amsterdam and continue to work towards AIDS 2020 virtual. So for more information, you can go to the International Indigenous HIV/AIDS community website at www.iihac.org. So today's speakers, we have 4 of them today, and I'll just quickly list their names. The first presenter will be Elton Naswood from the United States. The second presenter will be Albert McLeod from Canada. The third presenter will be Terry Luciani from the French Polynesia. And the fourth presentation will be Clive Aspen from New Zealand. So this webinar will focus on Indigenous activists, including those living and or working with HIV, recognizing the multiple overlapping issues across our cultural identities and leadership roles that Indigenous peoples carry as they respond to HIV locally and internationally. From July 6th to 10th, the International AIDS Society is hosting the 23rd International AIDS Conference, the world's largest conference on HIV and AIDS. Originally to be held in San Francisco and Oakland, the first time in 2 cities, it is now in the face of the coronavirus pandemic to be an online experience, AIDS 2020 virtual. This format will enable participants to access the latest HIV science, advocacy, and knowledge through a combination of virtual sessions, community networking, and 24-hour plenary speaker schedules, reaching audiences around the globe. To conclude AIDS 2020 virtual, IS will host a session on breaking COVID-19 research policy analysts and frontline experiences. For more information on the 23rd International AIDS Conference, go to www.aids2020.org. So I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Elton Naswood. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Albert, and thank you everyone and my esteemed panelists for being here. I'm very excited to present on some Two-Spirit issues happening in the United States and kind of focus on, a community response and hopefully encourage everyone who's attending the international conference to enhance their abilities in terms of representation of Indigenous peoples in the HIV movement. I'm going to formally introduce myself. Yat Esha Elton Naswood and Chia Tohan Tabaha Bashashin Nakaidane Edisha Chaitat Nizani Edishanella the. What I said is, hello, my name is Elton Naswood. I am of the Near to the Water clan, born for the Edgewater clan. My maternal grandfather's clan is of the Mexican people, and my paternal grandfather's clan is of the Tango people. This is how I identify as Navajo. I also identify as a Two-Spirit male as well as a gay male in my communities. I'm currently living in Denver, Colorado in the United States. I'd like to honor the original inhabitants of this land, which are the Arapaho and Cheyenne people. So yeah, for allowing me to be here and live here. Really excited to be able to, to present during this time, fairly briefly on some of the movement and issues that we're organizing here in the United States. So, thank you. Again, my name is Elton Naswood. I'm actually the co-coordinator for the National Native HIV Network. And so very happy to be here to present. Here in the US, we utilize the Two-Spirit term to identify Native Americans, Alaska Natives who also identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgendered individuals. The term is more contemporary, but really focuses on the traditional and cultural roles of cultural understandings of our gender roles and identity. It was first coined in the early 1990s at the third International Two-Spirit Gathering in Winnipeg, Canada, where a group of advocates like ourselves who identify as Two-Spirit came together and wanted a more empowering cultural term to identify ourselves to the world. And so the term was adapted from an Anishinaabe term, which translates into Two-Spirits, which means to have a feminine and a masculine spirit in one's own identity, but also one's own expression and spirituality. But the term as well, like I like to say here in the US, has many different meanings to different tribal communities as well. Here in the United States, we have over 572 federally recognized tribes with over 200 different tribal languages. So this umbrella term of Two-Spirits has really many different meanings to, in many of our different tribal communities. And I always like to explain that to people. One of the examples in my own Navajo language, as I introduced myself, when we translate the American term of Two-Spirit, it could have a totally different meaning in my own language, which could possibly mean to have a good spirit as well as a not so good spirit. So I'm very cautious when I use the term, but I myself identify in that way and feel comfortable in that identification. Two-Spirit is not a term that is used by non-Native people. I have this conversation all the time here in the United States that I have non-Native relatives who like to say, oh, I'm Two-Spirit too. And I've gotten to a point where I got to tell them, no, you're not, because what comes with that term is an identity and a responsibility that as a non-Native person, you may not fully comprehend or acknowledge that in that way. So I kind of discourage our non-Native relatives from utilizing, the term that is really meant for us. And as mentioned, it's not necessarily a term used or adopted by all of our tribes here in the US based upon their cultural interpretations as well. But if a person would like to use the term to identify themselves, we also encourage that. Two-Spirit is a cultural term used in many rural and urban Native communities here in the US to reclaim our traditional identity and roles. This is just a list of a handful of tribes here in the United States who still utilize cultural terms in their languages to identify individuals who may identify as Two-Spirit or Native LGBTQ. Examples include Crow, which have the term bote, which is more of a masculine male understanding of their gender. Navajo, for my tribe, we have a term nugle, which is actually a term that can be utilized for male and female. Lakota people have the term winkday. The Zuni Pueblo has a term lemana. And then the Tongva people, which are the original inhabitants of the Los Angeles Basin, have a term Wewa Akin. But they're one of the only tribes that I know that has a specific term that identifies our transgender relatives, and that is Kuya. And that is the specific term that is for a transgender person, primarily a person who has transitioned from being a male and presents as female now. And I found that very interesting when I lived in the Los Angeles area, and really kind of use that to express that there's a resurgence of our identity by finding languages that represent us as Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ individuals. And a lot of us have gone through different colonization processes as well. And so some of that identity is taken away. But for me, if a tribal language has a term for us specifically, that means we existed prior to colonization, and hence the roles and responsibilities are really important in that way. I just wanted to honor some of the most affluent Two-Spirit Native LGBT individuals within our tribal communities, which kind of kind of we reflect on in terms of honoring who we are and our own identity. Wewa was from the Zuni Pueblo. She would be someone we would term as a transgendered woman today. But, you know, Wewa was a cultural ambassador, was also a caretaker, also was a negotiator, and was, you know, there's stories told about her that she got to go to Washington, D.C. and visit our president at the time, President Cleveland, but also dined with the First Lady and her entourage. And you know, the non-Native people and the politicians at that time did not know she was, you know, a transgender person. And this is a portrait of her in female regalia from the Zuni Pueblo. A lot of the Pueblos here in the United States are very, how can I put it? They're very traditional in a way that they don't let outsiders into their community. So her story is really relevant and prevalent to our understanding of you know, transgender people, but also as Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ people as well. Ashtish was also, you know, another great person we recognize, and she came from the Crow tribe. The Indian name was finds them and kills them. There are a number of stories about Ashtish. Played very masculine roles, was a warrior, a very skilled warrior, and a horse, you know, and rode horses very well as well. And then the last person is Hastine Claw, who is from my tribe, you know, the Navajo Nation. And Hastine Claw was very wealthy, and the way we considered wealth amongst our Navajo people is to have, you know, care for many sheep that we have. You know, there are stories told that he was a great negotiator as well with some of the traders, the non-Native traders that we had in the area, but also was a skilled weaver, which was primarily a female role, but he was given the ability to weave some sacred rugs that now exist in some of these communities that, or some of these museums that are now in the United States. So I just wanted to give some historical information about what it means to be Two-Spirit, what it means to be Native LGBT here in the US as well. These next couple of slides are going to kind of talk about some of the health issues that we experience as Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ individuals. Physical health, we talk about you know, the physical aspects of our, you know, of our living, and some of the you know, disease and viruses that affects us in that way, and one of them being HIV. We had an increase of 46% of amongst American Indian Alaska Native individuals who were diagnosed with HIV within the 2010 to 2016, as well as 81%, which is a very high number amongst our American Indian Alaska Native gay and bisexual men. We've had over an estimated 3,600 American Indians and Alaska Natives who were diagnosed with HIV in 2016, with 82% of them who received the diagnosis, as well as other individuals who do get HIV care as well. Research has revealed that the urban LGBT and Two-Spirit Natives experience discrimination and decreases their self-rated health, increases self-reported physical pain and impairment. Amongst our Native transgender community, there has been reported of 65% who have been sexually assaulted, as well as 50% of that population who had negative health care impacts as well. And then this slide talks about the mental health, which, you know, majority of Indigenous peoples, we experience historical trauma, which is just the trauma that continues from generation to generation, and as a part of that has a very significant impact on our mental health as well. And these are just some statistics that validate some of those issues that happen to our community in terms of mental health. Generally, LGBTQ youth experience 2 to 3 times more likely to attempt suicide than straight youth. 46% of our Native transgender respondents experience serious psychological distress. And this is a big statistic. More than half, 56% of our transgender individuals have attempted suicide. And there are higher levels of stigma in our tribal communities. Also existing as well are racism, biases, homophobia, transphobia, discrimination as well.
Just wanted to intervene, Elton. Your 10 minutes is up, so if you could just wrap up your presentation,
sure.
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. The screen. Okay,
just a reminder.
Yes, and these are just some statistics for our Native transgender individuals, which again show a high rate, of instances of healthcare as well as suicide. And then just a couple of slides. I wanted to highlight some of our TwoSpirit organizations here in the United States, and one of them being the Montana TwoSpirit. They have a gathering every summer, and unfortunately, this year it's canceled. But as a part of their gathering, they do a lot of HIV.
Co-director of the Two-Spirited people in Manitoba, and I've been involved in the AIDS movement since 1979 when I went to move to Vancouver, which we know HIV was moving into North America, into the large urban centers. And that it did affect a lot of my peers, my friends, the people that were living there at the time who were First Nations, Inuit, or Métis people who had migrated to these large urban centers in Canada and the US. And unbeknownst to us, we knew there was a sexually transmitted virus there. And so, 40 years later, this is sort of a retrospective on that era and what role science and research and these international AIDS conferences play in that history. And as Albert mentioned earlier, the contribution of Indigenous people and Two-Spirit people to the U.S. and Indigenous response to HIV and AIDS over these last 40 years. So I'm going to share a few slides with you that sort of puts context into what the structure of the International AIDS Conference looks like. And I'm just going to share the screen and pull up my slides. Okay, so here's the first slide, and it's just about, that Two-Spirits, as I said, from the very starting of the international pandemic of HIV, we have been affected and we have been responding. So for us, this is not new. We're not latecomers to the scene. We have been responsive to the realities of HIV as well as the seriousness of AIDS diagnosis. In Canada, we have about 1.7 million Indigenous people, and the majority are First Nations. The largest population are Métis, and then the Inuit. And I estimate in any population, about 10% could be LGBTQ. And in this case, that would be 167,000 Indigenous people in Canada could be LGBTQ. So that is a significant population to consider when we do these types of interventions, especially around sexually transmitted infections. As well, in Canada, we know that there's been difficulty in actually addressing HIV prevention for men who have sex with men, and that in the Indigenous population of men who have sex with men, we don't know that impact of how many Indigenous Two-Spirit men could be living with HIV or have been diagnosed with AIDS. So this, as Elton had said, we need to follow the data or the statistics that are put out in order to get the resources we need to address the issues. So in Canada, I attended 2 international conferences 10 years apart. The Vancouver conference, which was at the time when the antiretrovirals were coming online for people. And it was really a time when it was saving people's lives around the world. People who were had full-blown AIDS, and that a lot of people were really seeking these medications in order to preserve their life and save their life. So there was a lot of advocacy in this particular AIDS conference in Vancouver. And then 10 years later, Canada hosted again, and this was in Toronto. And in terms of the sort of underlying issues that happened. But before I get there, in terms of in Vancouver, there was TwoSpirit volunteers from the Greater Vancouver Native Cultural Society. So this is a TwoSpirit group that was founded in 1979. So very early on, if you think about queer liberation in North America. And so they were able to volunteer to help with the coordination of this particular conference in downtown Vancouver. As well as in 2006, we did a fundraising event in the village there on Church Street, and it was for the Two-Spirited people of the First Nations organization. And we had Inuit Tina, we had Mama Terry from New Zealand did a performance, and she's since passed away. And then we had Connie Vicious from Manitoba also did a drag performance, as well as I did a drag performance. And I still have my heels today, so I may have to bring them out in the future. And again, as I mentioned, the themes of both conferences. So there was a very active group called AIDS ACT UP internationally that would advocate on behalf of people around HIV testing, HIV diagnosis, and then those people who were living with AIDS in terms of getting governments around the world to respond, whether it was treatment, housing, those kind of things. And so they would intervene at these international conferences and do disruption type actions to bring attention to the various issues. So they were very prominent at these international conferences, but as now we know, with the antiretrovirals being available, that type of advocacy is not as common or prevalent in these national events. But in 1996, there was an action that happened. This wasn't it. It was actually, what we did is everybody turned their back on the Canadian Minister of Health when he spoke in the plenary session at the these new medications released to people with HIV and AIDS. And so the slogan at the time was greed equals death, and we demand access to antiretrovirals for all people. The theme of the second conference 10 years later was a bit different, and Toronto's a very cosmopolitan town, and in the opening conference they had a fashion show as part of it, and one of our well-known opera singers from Canada, Nyasha Berger-Grosseman, as a soprano, did a song or sang during this Revlon lipstick fashion show, which showed 27 different shades of red lipstick. So that was something I really remember from that particular conference. So again, art and entertainment is also part of these events. It's not all about science and those kind of things. Now the conference format is, initially in 1985 at the first AIDS conference, it was very scientific and medical, and it was only advocacy from the community that brought in the community sector to be a part of this international conference, which on average is about 20,000 people with about 4,000 to 8,000 media. So these are huge conferences, and the facilities are gigantic. And when people could travel, it was sometimes concourses would be a mile long that people had to navigate. So the scientific track has basic research, clinical research, epidemiology, social and behavioral research, implementation research, and then political research. For community, we have local engagement, cultural exchange, scholarships, people with living with HIV/AIDS, community forums, as mentioned, advocacy, pre-conferences, and then we had the AIDS quilt.
Well, this is your 1 minute.
Yeah, I'm almost there.
Thank you.
So part of this is all about, finding abstracts specific to Indigenous people. And here's an example of one that is going to be in the Indigenous pre-conference in July. And so this is specific to Two-Spirit people around health, sexuality, and sexual behavior. And again, this is the more detailed. And then in that, so finding two-spirit abstract presentation, either the word Indigenous, Two-Spirit, or MSM for men who have sex with men. Then you can download the abstracts that you're interested in and you can read them later. Also, there may be live virtual presentations that will be recorded. And then take time for breaks while online participating in the conference, because sometimes it's a stretch of 4 hours. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Albert. Very sound advice coming from a super amazing person. I'd like to now introduce our third presenter, Terry Luciani, and you have the floor.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yep.
Okay. My name is Terry E. from Tahiti. So I'm LGBT activist for the last 20 years, but I've been living overseas for more than, I just been back to my home island country 5 years ago, and there was no more leader in the LGBT community, and as well our AIDS working group had no more leader, and I took the role to lead these two groups. So I will start my presentation. It's a very short presentation. So in French Polynesia, we say Maohi Nui now. Last year we had a young lady dying from AIDS, and that's a very sad fact. And I wanted to raise that fact with you. So French Polynesia is a very small country. It's a French overseas collectivity, 118 islands dispersed on more than 2,000 kilometers. So it's about the size of Europe, in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean. Our population is about 280 people, and we have 54 people living with HIV/AIDS. In brief, the 150 patients receiving medical treatment, probably we have more with HIV, around 10 to 20, but it's a rough estimation. All patients have access to effective treatment, and it's free of charge. And so if they take their treatment, they can stay in good health. New infections, it's about 10 new person infected per year. So we have in Tahiti a very strong, we have the health system is strong. We have a global national strategy on STD, AIDS, with preventing campaign, leaflets, campaign. We have a very strong system with all the treatment available. Our government spent lots of money in the health system. So there's no reason for people to die today in 2020. So that's a main concern for me, and that's why I want to be strong and try to get our government and our authorities, health authorities, to think of what is the reason we have people dying of AIDS today in Tahiti. So on the screen, you have, it's Maire Bob Dupont. She was our leader for our local AIDS group for more than 20 years. She was also a great leader in the Pacific region. She met Bill Clinton, Nelson Mandela, and she started the regional program about fighting HIV and AIDS in the Pacific region. So although we're a small country, we had some people from our little island going to the region and be advocating for HIV/AIDS. So that's again the story of the young lady dying from AIDS last year. So we were very sad, and our system is very, very good, the health system. So the main doctor, and it's also my personal opinion, it is a failure in our system. And we believe that it's a lot of our strategy, health system for HIV AIDS are copy and paste from France. And so they are not very effective in the sense that indigenous people, sometimes with the culture, we don't understand that it's important to take your treatment every day. Usually, if they don't feel sick, they don't understand why they have to take a treatment. So this is cultural and tradition. Our construction of health is different from a Western construction of health. So this is a main point, and I want to work with our health system in Tahiti about that topic. So in Trenchpreneur, almost 400 people have been infected in the last 30 years. A young woman died last year, a failure. And so with our little group, Agir contre le SIDA, we're trying to make a strong voice to be heard by our government and our leader in the health system. So the three last slides are the official data, so it's just for information. But here in Tahiti, our LGBT group is an AIDS group has been missing motivation from local community to work on all the issues. And so it's since I'm back, I'm trying, but I don't have a lot of people around me. So that's why I'm looking for connection and experience from other group. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terry. I appreciate your presentation. I think that our viewers and the audience could agree. It's very sad to hear of a young woman in this day and age passing away from HIV and AIDS. And I think you can draw from other indigenous communities and countries going forward. And you're right, making those connections is really critical. So through this, through AIDS 2020, you'll be able to do that networking, which we normally would do face to face. But you speak of a time when Canada was in those predicaments, and so we can really connect with you on where you are, and know that you're not alone. We're all connected and ready to help if we can. So I thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you. Maruru.
I'd like to now ask Clive Aspen from New Zealand to step up. You've got some time, and we look forward to your presentation. Clive? Yeah.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko tēnei timi atu nei ki a koutou. Ko tai mai nei ki tēnei hui. Nō reira ki a koutou katoa ka nui timi atu ki a koutou. So greetings everybody from Aotearoa, and thank you to the people who spoke earlier, and thank you for your great presentations. So I'm speaking to you from the edge of the world. Often New Zealand is left off the map. And I'm actually located in this little town here called Wellington. And some people may not know where New Zealand is, but they may know who our Prime Minister is. She's achieved world fame by declaring New Zealand to be COVID-free. And we were free of COVID for almost 30 days, but now we have new transmissions, but we still have a fantastic leader. And I put her image here because I just want to briefly talk to you about the importance of leadership in the HIV movement. and especially in the Indigenous HIV movement. I also want to briefly touch on pandemics, because we can now say that we have lived through 2 pandemics, the HIV pandemic, now the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm going to finish by pointing out what some of the challenges are for us as Indigenous people. In the early days of the epidemic in New Zealand, a man called Tarangi Magavi said, if we do not take responsibility and start the dialogue between family members and hapu and iwi, that's tribes, at every occasion, the impact of this new disease is going to be 10 times worse. Don't live in ignorance, because it has a cost. The cost is the impact on our whakapapa, that's genealogy. We want to be able to protect our whakapapa, protect our genealogy. It's about survival and about continuation. And Te Tarangi uttered those words in 1994. Pandemics have a habit of causing anxiety. Susan Sontag said, any disease that is treated as a mystery and acutely enough feared will be felt to be morally, if not literally, contagious. And I think we've all experienced the negative impact on our communities when there's uncertainty about what's happening. We are sensing that now in terms of COVID, and we experienced that with HIV. In the very beginning of the epidemic, it was people the 4H's was used as a shorthand way of identifying people most at risk, and therefore the people to be marginalised from our community. Homosexuals, heroin users, hookers, Haitians, they could just as well have added Indigenous people, because now we know that Indigenous people have had higher rates of HIV than other people. In the early days of the epidemic in New Zealand, this report came out and identified the risks, that identified Māori as a vulnerable population because of these factors: the youthful age structure, unemployment, poor housing, alienation from family, and the list goes on. But these 2 at the bottom are particularly important. Lack of access to culturally appropriate services, poor access to resources such as condoms are 2 important factors that have placed Māori at increased risk of HIV. And these factors apply across the board to other Indigenous populations. We know that Indigenous people have higher rates of HIV, and there's been very few studies done into this issue. But in 2011, I was very fortunate to be able to join a collaboration, and we found that Indigenous people in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand all experience higher rates of HIV than other people. This is one of the few epidemiological studies into the impact of HIV in Indigenous populations. Indigenous people have been meeting to deal with these challenges. This is from the last HIV conference, the last AIDS conference, and still the same factors have been identified as those that place us at increased risk of HIV. We have higher rates, we have poor access to services, we have higher rates of stigma and discrimination. Indigenous people are less likely to be tested for HIV and more likely to test late. And as we know, women are disproportionately affected. I wanted to show you this image because this is one of the examples of Indigenous people taking control and coming up with initiatives that are appropriate to us and that are useful for us. These photos were taken at Toronto 2006. Another really important initiative driven by Canada and Khan, to whom we have a great deal of gratitude, was this important report that came out documenting lessons learned. What have we learned at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic? Well, we've had international AIDS conferences, as we've heard already today. We've had a significant presence at all AIDS conferences, especially since 1996. And in 2006, we saw the formation of IGWA, International Indigenous Working Group on HIV and AIDS, and also then subsequently the International HIV and AIDS Community. We've had a strong presence at pre-conferences, we've had a strong presence at plenaries and workshops, but I have to say it hasn't been without a lot of hard work and a lot of positioning and activism on the part of some of our leaders. And we've also, over recent years, had a strong presence at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. But there are still barriers to making progress. Still, we have difficulty in getting access to testing. Still, we have difficulty in getting access to treatment. HIV is criminalized in some parts of the world, and that creates a major barrier to moving forward and getting rid of disparities. We still need human rights protections. We still need the implementation, universal information for harm reduction services right across the board, and drugs need to be decriminalized everywhere in the world. There are some positive signs. At the last conference in Amsterdam, this man here, whose image you can see before you, announced the launch of a new coalition to expand diagnoses and treatments of HIV infections in men, which is so that those are two keys to breaking the cycle of HIV transmission and ultimately ending the AIDS epidemic as a public health threat by 2030. But we still have a long way to go. And as Indigenous people, we are well placed to learn from the past as we move and look towards the future. And in order to do that, we need to celebrate diversity. We need to ensure there is room for all of us. We need to work together. We need to strengthen the relationships that we have already and make them stronger. And we need to build Indigenous leadership. Together, we can stop the virus. And that's the reason we're coming together at the 23rd International AIDS Conference, where we were supposed to be meeting in person, but now we have the pleasure of meeting electronically. So these are some images I've taken over the years at various conferences I've attended. The one in the middle is from the Vienna conference. The one on the left is also from the Toronto conference. And the one down here is from the Amsterdam conference. So there's a big movement of Indigenous HIV activists. Long may it continue, and thank you to the work of all the leaders in our communities who have helped to make this possible and helped to make sure that we have a strong presence at international AIDS conferences. Nō reira, kia koutou, katoa, tēnei tini atu nei kia koutou. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clive. Thank you so much. We are now at the point in our agenda. We have about 10 minutes left for this session, and we set forth a 10-minute session for Q's and A's. And I'm sort of scanning the chat room, and I don't see very many presentations. One of the things I wanted to let everybody know is that this webinar is going to be posted online with the Youth and Women Indigenous webinars at www.iihac.org/82020. So given all these amazing presentations and the breadth of experiences that we have in this panel, something that was sort of driving me is around how we transfer all this amazing work and transfer this information to our youth. And one of the things that I wanted to maybe ask each of the panel presentators is, what kind of advice would you give the LGBTQ Two-Spirit youth, young activists going forward? What advice would you give them to move and advance this work? So I'll start off with Albert, if you can sort of give us an answer on that one.
Yeah, our focus in Manitoba is in a number of areas. One is really navigating with systems that control health services, and so we're looking at anti-racism. And you know that Black Lives Matter really made that prominent in the U.S., as well as the violence from police or the police in Canada against Indigenous people. And then we also look at sort of genocide in sort of colonial states against Indigenous people. So really the various states that control the medicine and the health and the funding dollars need to understand how genocide becomes a tool, and HIV and other illnesses become a part of that genocidal behavior from colonized states. And also, we're looking at sexual health and reclaiming Indigenous sexual health, because the mainstream system really gets intimidated in trying to transfer, sexual health knowledge around preventing STDs and HIV. And so a lot of times it gets dropped off the agenda, especially for Two-Spirit people. Either if you're a lesbian or a gay man, you've got health professionals in the field who don't want to talk about anal sex, or they don't want to talk about rimming, or they don't want to talk about, sex that LGBT people would engage in. So the youth don't hear that information. So what we established here in Winnipeg, it's called My Indigenous Sexual Health. And it's a network of Indigenous sexual health educators. And we are doing our own content, right? We're not waiting for, public health or the mainstream system. We're starting to using our traditional tools, like the legends, share information about body parts, about protocols and sexuality. And that's what we want to share with the youth, because they're very, informative, and the youth are attracted to them because they're culture-based and also language-based. So that's what we're doing here. And again, anti-racism with systems, I think, is very important to begin this negotiating equal access.
Great, thank you. Clive, I'm curious to hear your
advice to young people.
Yeah.
Well, that's a really good point, because the young people are the future of our movement, and I really encourage young people to get out there, make their voices heard, and join other groups of young people who are involved in activism, because you are our future. And I have to say, older people like me are really happy when young people step forward and say that they would like to be involved in things. So get out there, get involved, and don't be shy.
Thank you. Elton?
Hi, thank you, Albert. That's always a question, we ask when we're doing community organizing, is where's the youth a voice? And, some of the things that I think is important is that transfer of information, generation to generation, I think is lacking. Unfortunately, because of technology, and we're experiencing that now as older, an older generation doesn't have that ability for that traditional human interaction, right? So kind of really giving them space where we could have those conversations, directly, not only with elders, but aunties like me, who are not elder yet, but just having that opportunity to have those spaces to do that, and really encouraging youth to be activists in a way that they need to be seated at the table, in these spaces that we have. And then also utilizing a lot of peer-to-peer, discussions for them around HIV, around sexual health. There's an Indigenizing Love toolkit that was just developed here in the US that we're hoping to promote and have those conversations with the youth about HIV, sexual health, holistic health, all those issues. But I think, we need to be willing to sit in those circles with our youth, so then we could transfer that information and really enhance them in terms of, their own development as leaders. So that's kind of my perspective with that as well.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Elton. Terry, I'm curious of your thoughts.
It's about the same. So it's like keeping hope and believing that the young generation will be the future leader in all these issues. And in my little country, we have a lot of the age structure is many. We have a lot of young people. So I am really hoping that they will be the next leader.
Thank you. Thank you. Before we close the session, I would like to explain how the conference will be organized. It's very different. It's a different form of participation and new ways of staying connected. And we probably will never go back to the old ways of hosting the international AIDS conferences before COVID-19. The sessions are expanded access across the planet for this conference. There are always been problems with access to participation at the international AIDS conferences vis-a-vis fears of traveling to the US under current political situations, environmental impacts, and the carbon footprint. So this conference is divided into 4 days. The first day will start in a particular time zone. The second day will start in another time zone, and each time zone will have a morning's start convenient for them. So I think this conference will be very, very accessible to everybody. I'd like to thank the International HIV or Indigenous HIV/AIDS community and the Interagency Coalition on HIV and on AIDS and Development for hosting this webinar. And I'd like to thank the International AIDS Society for hosting AIDS 2020 virtual. And I'd like to give my heartfelt thank you to all the presenters, Elton, Albert, and Terry, and Clive, for your amazing presentations and advice and insight. And I'd like to thank all the participants for joining us for this session. Thank you and take care.
Thanks, Wayne. Bye, everybody.